The night my sister announced her engagement, my mother handed me a mop. Not metaphorically. An actual mop, still damp, smelling of pine cleaner, pressed into my hands in front of 30 of Chicago's most prominent families. "Claire, sweetheart," she said, loud enough to carry across the marble foyer. The caterers tracked something in from the garden. "You're good at being useful, aren't you?" The room went quiet for just a moment, that specific, sharp quiet that only exists when everyone hears something they pretend not to. Then conversation resumed, and I was invisible again. She had no idea she was handing a mop to the woman who had just been confirmed as a federal judge. She had no idea the ground her party stood on the event venue, the catering company. The very building was managed by a holding company that traced back to a trust my father had left solely in my name. The eviction notice wasn't drafted yet. But it would be. My name is Claire Ellison. I am 32 years old, and I had just driven 4 hours from Washington, D.C., to attend my sister Vanessa's engagement party in the house I grew up in the Lakeview neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. The drive had been long and quiet in the way I'd learned to appreciate. In Washington, silence was rare and expensive. The kind of silence that filled my car on the I-90 was different. It held no agenda. It asked nothing of me. I'd needed that, because what waited at the end of that drive would demand everything. The house appeared as I turned onto Belmont Avenue. It was a beautifully restored Victorian. 3 stories, dark blue with white trim. The kind of house that made people slow their cars. My mother, Diane, had maintained it with the obsessive precision of someone whose entire identity lived within its walls. The window boxes were always perfect. The brass door knocker was always polished. The curated image of family prosperity was always immaculate. I parked on the street because my old spot in the driveway was occupied by my brother-in-law-to-be's Porsche. I sat for a moment with the engine off, watching the warm light spill from the first-floor windows. Silhouettes moved behind the gauze curtains. I could already hear the low hum of an expensive party. My father used to sit on the front steps and wait for me when I came home from college. He'd have 2 cups of coffee, even if I arrived at midnight. He'd hand me mine without a word, and we'd sit there in the cold watching the street breathe. He never needed to fill silence. He understood that some things were better felt than said. He'd been gone 4 years. The steps were empty. I let myself in with my key. The foyer was crowded with people I recognized from years of my mother's carefully constructed social landscape: city aldermen, partners from old law firms, a news anchor from the local ABC affiliate. My mother moved through them like a conductor, orchestrating admiration with the practiced ease of someone who had been performing her entire adult life. She found me within 90 seconds. She always found me within 90 seconds. "Claire." She said my name the way a person says, "oh," when they open a gift they didn't want. She kissed the air next to my cheek. Her eyes swept over my dress, simple, navy, well-made but not flashy, and I watched her file her disappointment away for later. "I wasn't sure you'd make it. You look tired." "I'm fine. Congratulations to Vanessa." "Where is she?" "She's with Marcus's family." "Don't interrupt them. They're having a moment." She paused, then tilted her head toward the hallway. "Actually, the kitchen needs the staff is overwhelmed. You could help with—" "I'm a guest," I said. She smiled a smile. "Of course you are, sweetheart." 20 minutes later, she handed me the mop. I took it. I held it for exactly 3 seconds. Then I set it against the wall with the same deliberate calm I used when I set down my pen after signing an opinion that would affect hundreds of thousands of people. I walked to the bar, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and went to find my father's old armchair in the corner of the study, where nobody ever bothered to go during parties because there was no one important to perform for in there. There was a photograph on the study wall I hadn't seen before. It was new, or newly framed, a large professional image of my mother and Vanessa at some charity gala, both in evening gowns, laughing at something off camera. It was beautiful. The photograph that used to hang in that spot had been taken on the steps of the Supreme Court building. I was 27 in that photo, in a blazer, holding a portfolio of briefs I'd argued as a clerk. My father had driven to Washington specifically to take it. He'd worn his good coat. The new photo was unquestionably better framed. I sat with my sparkling water and let the party exist around me, without me in it. My sister found me an hour later. Vanessa was luminous the way some women are on the night they get everything they were told to want. Her ring was spectacular. Her fiancé, Marcus Webb, was handsome in the easy, expensive way of men who had never been told no. I liked him about as much as I liked most things. I didn't know well enough to trust yet cautiously, with quiet reservations. "You came," she said, and she sounded genuinely surprised, which told me more than she probably intended. Of course I came. She sat across from me, tucking her gown under her. For a moment, she was just my little sister again, 11 years old and stealing my sweaters. Then, the party version of her reassembled itself. "Mom says you've been distant." "I've been in Washington. It's geographically distant. You know what I mean." I did know what she meant. I also knew that the story of my distance had been written by someone other than me and accepted without my input. I didn't say that. I raised my glass. "I'm happy for you, Vanessa." "I mean that." She looked at me for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes, uncertainty, maybe, or something more like guilt. Then Marcus appeared in the doorway, and she stood, and the moment closed. That night, in the guest room, the smallest room, the one without a closet, the one next to the boiler, I stared at the ceiling and let the question I never asked out loud float up through the dark. Why? Not with anger, with honest bewilderment. My mother was not stupid. She was not cruel in a simple way. She was a woman who had organized her entire worldview around a specific kind of success, visible, social, easily legible to the people she wanted to impress. Vanessa was that kind of success. A beautiful engagement, a handsome architect from a good family, a life that photographed well. I had chosen a different architecture. Federal clerkship. Law review. 7 years of building a record in ways that didn't translate to dinner party conversation. And then, 8 months ago, a confirmation hearing that I had specifically, deliberately kept from my mother until it was done. Because I had learned, slowly and at great cost, that sharing my victories with her was like planting something in salt. Nothing grew. It just burned. I found my phone and pulled up the last voicemail my father had ever left me. I had kept it for 4 years and listened to it more times than I could count. His voice was unhurried, a little rough, entirely him. "Hey kid, just thinking about you. Read that opinion you cited in your brief, the Harmon case," and I thought, that's my daughter. She sees the thing under the thing. Always has. Don't let anybody flatten you down to something they can understand easier. The complicated ones are always worth more. Talk soon. He never talked soon. He died 12 days later from a heart attack that nobody saw coming, least of all me. 400 miles away in a federal courthouse filing a brief that I'd thought mattered more than a phone call home. The guilt of that had never fully metabolized. I didn't think it ever would. I put the phone down and made myself breathe. I had work to do. Not the kind with legal pads and case law. The other kind. 3 weeks before the engagement party, I had received a letter that changed the quiet geometry of my life in Chicago. My father's estate attorney, a careful, meticulous man named Howard Park, who had been my father's college roommate and closest friend, sent me a registered envelope that contained, among other documents, a property assessment and a letter in my father's handwriting. I had read that letter 6 times before I understood what he'd done. My father had known. Not about everything, not about the mop or the photograph taken down or the 100 small erasures my mother had conducted over the years. But he had known the shape of it. He had known his wife well enough and his daughter well enough to understand that what came after him would not be fair. And so, with the quiet, strategic patience that had characterized everything he ever did, he had acted. The Victorian house on Belmont Avenue was not my mother's. It had never legally been my mother's. Through a trust established 15 years ago, the property had been structured such that upon his death, the house entered a revocable living trust with me as sole trustee. My mother had right of residence for as long as she chose to remain there. But the title was mine, had been mine for 4 years while I'd had no idea. Howard Park had waited until I was confirmed to a lifetime appointment on the federal bench before sending the letter. I asked him, on the phone, why he'd waited so long. There was a pause. Then he said, "Your father wanted you to be completely untouchable before you knew. He didn't want you to have power you weren't ready to hold quietly." I sat with that for a long time. There was more. My father had also, over 20 years, made investments in several Chicago real estate properties that I had always assumed were purely financial holdings with no emotional significance. They were not. The building that housed the event venue company my mother used exclusively for her social calendar. the kitchen supplier for her preferred catering firm. 3 of them, a quiet, patient architecture of protection, built over decades, that I had never seen because I had not known to look. My father was a man who had spent his career as an appellate court judge. He understood, better than most, that the most durable power was the kind nobody saw coming. I loved him so much, it was almost structural, like the love was part of my actual skeleton. After the engagement party, I drove back to Washington. I called Howard from the highway. "I want to understand the full picture," I said. "Everything." "I thought you might call after this weekend," he said. He spent 2 hours walking me through it. By the time I reached the DC line, I knew exactly what my father had built, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. Not out of anger. The anger had burned out somewhere around the 4th hour of the drive back, replaced by something colder and more useful. Something that felt, if I was honest, a great deal like my father's patience. The wedding was in 6 weeks. I had work to do. The first unexpected ally arrived as an email, 3 days after I returned to Washington. The sender's name was Dr. Priya Mehta. I recognized it immediately. She had been my constitutional law professor at Northwestern, the most rigorous, demanding, least impressible person I had encountered in 3 years of law school. She had also, I learned later, been a close friend of my father's, since they'd served together on an advisory board for a legal aid foundation in the 90s. The email was 4 lines. "I know about the trust. Howard told me, with your father's instructions, that I should reach out when the time came. I'd like to have dinner. I think you need a second opinion on how to proceed." "Not legally. Strategically, Priya," I replied within the hour. We met at a small Ethiopian restaurant in DuPont Circle. Priya was exactly as I remembered, compact, direct, with the kind of stillness that suggested she had never wasted a word in her life. She was 61. She looked 50. She had argued 4 cases before the Supreme Court and won 3 of them. She ordered for both of us without asking, which, under other circumstances, would have annoyed me. Under these, it was just efficient. "Your father talked about you constantly," she said, once the injera arrived. Not in a sentimental way, in an analytical way. He would say, "Priya, Claire just did this," and describe whatever you'd accomplished, and then he'd say, "She doesn't know I'm watching, but I am." He was always watching. I set down my fork. "He was also worried," she continued. "Not about your career. Your career was never the concern. He was worried that you would win everything out there," she gestured loosely toward the window, "toward Washington, and still lose the one thing that mattered to him. Your sense of who you were before all of this. Before the titles." "He hid a real estate empire from me to protect my sense of self?" I said. She almost smiled. "He hid it to give you choices. There's a difference." She broke a piece of bread carefully. "What do you want to do with what you now know?" I told her. All of it: the engagement, the wedding, my mother's management of the family narrative, the mop, the photograph on the wall. She listened without expression, which was how I knew she was actually listening. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "There are 2 ways to do what you're describing," she said finally. "The first one feels better in the moment and accomplishes very little. The second one takes longer, requires more restraint, and leaves something standing when it's done. Something real. Which one do you want?" "The second one. Then you need documentation, not drama. You need the truth delivered in a format that cannot be argued with, in a room where it can't be controlled." She poured more tea for both of us. "And you need someone on the inside." The someone on the inside turned out to be the wedding planner. Her name was Jonelle Carter. She was 38, meticulous, had been planning events in Chicago for 12 years, and she had worked with my father's company, the holding company, which my mother had always believed belonged to an anonymous investment group, for 6 of those years. When Howard Park made a quiet phone call explaining who the silent principal of that investment group actually was, Jonelle called me directly. "I've been waiting for someone to call me," she said, without preamble. We had a 2-hour video call that night. Jonelle was not a woman who required explanation twice. She understood the landscape immediately. She also, it turned out, had her own history with my mother: 3 years of last-minute changes, unpaid rush fees, and being introduced at events as our girl who handles the logistics rather than by her actual name or company. She was not angry about it. She was organized about it. "I need access to the AV setup at the venue," I said. "And I need to know the exact program order for the reception." "Already have both," she said. "I want to be careful, even now, about how I describe what came next, because it would be easy to frame this as a revenge plot, and that would be both inaccurate and unworthy of what my father had built. This was not revenge. Revenge is personal and hot, and concerned only with the wound. What we were building was something more like a correction, a rebalancing, a setting of the record straight in the specific, undeniable language of fact. We worked for 5 weeks. Priya consulted on strategy. Jonelle managed the operational details. Howard Park prepared the documentation, a clean, clear, legally precise summary of the property trust, the holdings, and their history, formatted not for a courtroom, but for a room of people who would understand immediately what they were reading. I contributed one more thing, a video. I did not make it myself. I reached out to a former law school colleague who now led a civil rights foundation in Chicago, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been at my confirmation hearing and who my father had quietly funded for 3 years through a donor-advised fund nobody had ever traced back to him. When I explained what I needed and why, Sandra spent 30 seconds thinking and then said, "Give me a week." The video was 4 minutes long. It contained testimonials from 3 people, a woman whose housing discrimination case I had clerked on and whose outcome I had directly influenced, a former student of mine from a single semester I'd taught at Georgetown Law who was now a public defender in Baltimore, and Sandra herself, speaking about the foundation grant and its source. None of them mentioned my mother. None of them needed to. They just told the truth about what I had done and what my father had done quietly behind it. 4 minutes. The whole thing ran 4 minutes. The wedding was held at the Civic Opera House, a venue of extraordinary grandeur and very specific acoustics. It was a Saturday in October. Chicago had decided to be beautiful about it. The sky was a clear, punishing blue, and the trees along Wacker Drive had gone the color of old pennies. I arrived alone. I wore a deep charcoal dress, simple, well-cut, the kind of thing that announces nothing and holds everything. I found my seat in the 3rd row. I was not in the wedding party. I had never been asked. My mother had arranged the seating chart such that I was bracketed on both sides by Marcus's extended family from Connecticut, people who knew no one and would not notice if I sat quietly. I sat quietly. The ceremony was beautiful. Vanessa was genuinely radiant, and Marcus genuinely couldn't take his eyes off her. And for the duration of the vows, I let myself just be a sister who loved her sister, which was true and did not require any complication. The reception was in the adjoining ballroom, a vast gold and ivory space with 20-foot ceilings and a stage at the far end. My mother had commissioned a formal program, printed on heavy cardstock, with a schedule down to the minute. She had also, I knew from Jonelle, planned to deliver a speech of approximately 12 minutes, a carefully constructed monologue about family legacy and the importance of roots and the particular kind of success embodied by the Webb-Ellison Union. She had been working on it for weeks. She had shared drafts with Vanessa. She had not shared it with me, because there would have been no version of that speech in which I appeared as anything other than a peripheral footnote. The dinner service ended. The program called for toasts. My mother rose from her seat at the head table, champagne in hand, smile assembled. The microphone gave a small, polite squeal of feedback. And then Jonelle's voice came quietly through the earpiece I hadn't told my mother about. "We're ready when you are." A woman stood up from a table near the back of the room. I recognized her immediately. Sandra Okafor, in a beautiful dark green dress, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent 15 years speaking in rooms that did not want to hear what she had to say. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," Sandra said, and her voice carried the way voices do when a person has learned to fill space without raising their pitch. I was asked to say a few words before the formal toasts. "I'll be brief." She looked, for just a moment, directly at me. "I think most of you know me through the Okafor Foundation. What most of you don't know is that this foundation has been able to do what it does for the past 4 years in large part because of one person. A person who specifically asked to remain anonymous. I'm here tonight because that person told me it was time to stop being anonymous." My mother had frozen. Her champagne glass was still raised. The lights in the room shifted slightly. Jonelle, at the AV board and the large screen behind the stage, which had been displaying a rotating gallery of engagement photos, went quietly dark. The video began. 4 minutes. The woman whose housing case had changed. The young public defender in Baltimore. Sandra's own testimony. The faces were clear, the voices steady, and in the 3rd minute, when the former student from Georgetown looked into the camera and said, She told us that the law was not a shield for the powerful, it was supposed to be a door for everyone who'd been locked out. And then she lived that. While nobody was watching, I heard the first sounds from the room. Not applause. Just the particular silence that means people are revising what they thought they knew. When the video ended, Sandra said one more thing. Her name is the Honorable Claire Ellison. She is a federal judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. She is also, and I say this because she would never say it herself, the reason that 94 families in this city are in safe homes tonight instead of on the street. She is the daughter of Judge Richard Ellison, whose quiet generosity built more in this city than any building with his name on it ever could. Sandra paused. I just thought the people who love her should know. The room was very still. My mother sat down. She didn't do it gracefully. She sat the way a person sits when their legs stop working. The applause started somewhere to my left. I couldn't see who began it, and then it spread the way that kind of applause does. From recognition outward, people standing not because they were swept up, but because they had made a conscious decision. A city alderman I had clerked for was on his feet. 3 people from the legal community who had been at my confirmation hearing were standing. Even some of Marcus's family from Connecticut, who had no context for any of this, were standing because the room made it clear that standing was the correct thing to do. I did not stand. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and let it wash over me, and I thought about my father sitting on those steps with 2 cups of coffee, waiting. I did not look at my mother for a long time. When I finally did, she was not looking at me. She was looking at her champagne glass, which she had set on the table, and she was very still in the specific way of someone who is calculating what remains salvageable. I knew that stillness. I had inherited it. We were more alike than either of us had ever been comfortable admitting. Vanessa found me during the dancing, in a quiet corner near the bar. She had been crying carefully, in the way of women who have learned to cry without ruining their makeup. She looked at me for a long time. "Why didn't you tell me?" she finally said. "Would you have believed me?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. That was its own kind of answer. "I'm not angry at you," I said. And I meant it. Vanessa had been raised in the same house under the same architecture, and had simply made different choices about which parts of it to inhabit. That wasn't evil. It was just human. I love you. I'm happy you're married. I mean both of those things completely. She hugged me, suddenly and tightly, the way she used to when she was 7 and had a nightmare. I held her for a moment. "I didn't know about the house," she said quietly, into my shoulder. "About any of it." "I didn't know. I know you didn't. What are you going to do?" I pulled back and looked at her. Nothing dramatic. Mom can stay as long as she wants to stay. But she's going to have an honest accounting of what's actually hers and what isn't. And going forward, we're going to have honest conversations. All of us. Vanessa nodded, slowly, like someone absorbing an instruction they know is right but aren't sure they're strong enough for. "Okay," she said. "Okay." My mother did not speak to me that night. I did not seek her out. There would be time for that conversation. I had already asked Howard to arrange a formal meeting with her and her attorney in 2 weeks, in a context where everything would be documented and nothing could be misremembered later. That was not the cold cruelty it might sound like. It was, in fact, the most honest thing I could offer her. No manipulation, no performance. Just the facts, laid out clearly, and a set of choices she could make with full information. My father had always said that the greatest respect you could show a person was to tell them the truth without softening it into something useless. I drove home the next morning. The city was quiet in the early hours, the lake gray, and enormous to my right. I had a case brief due by Monday and a hearing on Wednesday, and a clerk who had been waiting 3 days for my notes on a First Amendment question that deserved careful thought. My work was not finished. It was never finished. That was the thing about choosing a life in public service that nobody told you in law school. There was no end state. No moment where the work was done, and you could rest and say you'd fixed it. There was only the next case, the next hearing, the next decision that would matter to someone you would never meet. I had made peace with that a long time ago. What I hadn't made peace with, what I was still working on, in the honest accounting I tried to do of myself, was the loneliness of having done all of it without anyone in my family knowing. Not because I needed recognition. My father had taught me well enough that recognition was not the point. But there was a difference between not needing recognition and genuinely never having been seen. Even dim stars needed someone to look up. My phone lit up as I crossed into Indiana. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. I pulled over to read it. Judge Ellison. "My name is Deja Williams. I was one of the 94 families. I don't know how you got my number, but I saw the video someone posted from last night's event. I just wanted to say that my daughter started college last month. First in our family. She's studying pre-law. I told her what you did for us. She knows your name. She wants to be you someday. Thank you for existing quietly. Deja. I sat on the shoulder of the highway for a while with the hazard lights blinking, reading the message several times. Then I called my father's voicemail, the one I'd kept for 4 years. I didn't need to hear it, I just needed to tell him something. I said it out loud, to the gray Indiana sky through the windshield. She's studying pre-law, Dad. She wants to be a judge. I let that sit for a moment. Then I put the car in drive, and I went back to work. That's my story. I'm telling it because somewhere out there is another Claire, another person who has spent years building something real and true, while the people who were supposed to see them looked the other way. I'm telling it because my father believed the quiet ones were worth more, not less. And I'm telling it because Deja's daughter is going to need to know, when her moment comes, that the arena is not always where you expect it to be. Sometimes the hardest battle you will ever fight is the one for your own name, in the house you grew up in, among the people who should already know it. Fight that one with truth. Build something that lasts. And don't ever, ever let someone hand you a mop and call it your place. If this story stayed with you, share it in the comments. Tell me where you're tuning in from, and tell me whose voice do you carry with you when the room goes quiet. I'd love to hear it. And if you want more stories about the ones who built something in the dark, make sure you're subscribed. You're not as alone as the silence makes you feel.